Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Mack Crayton, and thank you for joining me for another episode of the interface between science and scripture. So I apologize for being a few minutes late here, but I want to jump right into it on this evening. Okay, so we're going to continue on with our conversation that we had last week about there being other people on earth when Adam and Eve was present. And we also talked last week about the possibility or the belief that some, and I tend to ascribe to, that there were two separate creations. There's the creation of humans in the end of Genesis chapter 1. I think it's about verse 26 or 27, where it says God created male and female, created he them. Okay, and then he gave them the charge to go forth to multiply, replenish the earth. Okay, so and as you're coming in, I forgot to say that send me a shout out, say hello or something to me so I can see who's in the room with me as we're moving forth. All right, and be sure to share if you are enjoying these lessons and you want others to see the episode. All right, so we're going to continue on with that thought. Okay, and so the second, and then we go over to Genesis, the second chapter, and we see that God makes Adam, and then he creates a garden and puts them in the garden, and then he makes the animals and presents them to Adam for him to name all of them. And then Adam could not find a companion, so he was supposed to not only name the animals, he was supposed to find a companion among the animals. And when he couldn't do so, God put him to sleep, and then took a rib from his body and formed woman, and there we had Eve. And so we saw a different sequential order, where we saw in the third day plants had already been made on the earth. And then early on in day 5, I think day 5, we talked about we had the birds and the marine animals made. And in day 6, early on in day 6, we had land-based animals made. And then man was made last. So that was in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, we saw that man was made first, then a garden, which would indicate plants. And then after the garden, then animals. And then Eve was made. You had woman made. So there's a difference in the sequential order, and therefore there are the two schools of thought that there were two separate creations of human beings. So to interface that with science, science states that there's anywhere from 12 to 25 different species of humans have existed on the earth. And my proposition to you is whether or not that first species was the humans that were made in Genesis 26 and 27. And perhaps that was Homo habilis, the first species of Homo sapiens. And then on God's seventh day of rest, which would be equated to millions of years, there was time for those humans to then begin to migrate out of around the continent of Africa. And as they did so, subsections of them, so let's say we had 50, or 100 of them even, and then 50 of them decided to branch off and say, let's find greener pastures, let's find places where there's more food, more shelter. We may be near a river or something, and we are far enough away from predators such as lions and tigers and cougars and those type of animals that would be predatory and living on the savannas of Africa where the humans were. Well, the 50 who stayed behind and said, we're not going anywhere, maybe they fell victim to a shortage of food. The predators may have eaten them, and that population of 50 eventually died off, and that's what we would call extinction of a species. Whereas the other 50 who moved on, they moved to a different geographical area where their bodies now had to adjust to the new climate that they were living in. And therefore, you may see changes in skin tone in order to allow more sunlight to penetrate their skin, so the lightening of the skin, or if they were moving more towards the equator into the southern part of the continent of Africa, they would need even darker skin to protect them from the harmful UV rays. Right, so we can see variations start to occur depending on where these groups of individuals split off. As they became adapted over generations, there may be changes in the DNA from the stressors, environmental stressors, and therefore it gave rise to new species of humans. And then they would branch off from that group and onto another and onto another until we got to our present day species of Homo sapiens. Hey, Mother Diana, thank you for that message. All right, and so that's how that would have happened. So if by the time Adam and Eve were created, we were already at our present day species predominating the earth, Homo sapiens, and therefore Adam and Eve would have been Homo sapiens, and we were moving forward, and we know that because Adam and Eve were the start of the holy bloodline. So they are God's chosen people, and if you follow the lineage, all the begats that's in the Bible in Genesis, you will see that it leads on down to Joseph, the father, earthly father of Jesus Christ, right? And all of the biblical characters that we see along the way, Noah and Moses and Abraham and Moses and the others were a part of that holy bloodline that leads down to Jesus. So if we were in English class or looking at a story, we would say these were the main characters, and then you have the supporting cast. Okay, so what would justify the supporting cast? So, of course, you know that we have God-chosen people. We're going to get to the Jews, but we also had Gentiles. We had the Samaritans, right? We had the Philistines. All of those people, it's like, where did they come from? Right? If you had the lineage of the holy bloodline, and then you had the other people that were paganistic in their beliefs. And pagan is a term that was really coined by Christians to describe people who believed in polytheistic gods. Okay, so we'll branch into there, and we'll slow the pace down just a little bit. You know, I try to talk fast so I can get into my 20-minute timeline there. So we begin to look at it. So with Adam and Eve, we are looking at a monotheistic God. Mono is a prefix that means one. Theistic means God, so you're looking at one God. Okay, whereas polytheistic, which would have been the other individuals, poly means many, and theistic, God. Okay, so polytheistic God would be the belief in gods of fertility, gods of wind, of rain, of the harvest, and all of that. And those individuals would have prayed to those particular gods, as compared to we have everything in one God. Right? And so that will be the difference between the lineage that's going to lead through Adam and Eve is going to lead through, versus the other humans that would have been on the earth and who would have been following the polytheistic views. Okay, so we want to then dive into, so as you can see, we're in Genesis, and we're going to actually be in Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4. And I want to talk about, the other thing. We've been hitting on that concept of time. So the Bible doesn't give us a real concept of what was the timeline of things as they were happening. And we're going to see that in chapter 4 as we get there. And I'll do some reading from chapter 4. So we kind of did
Someone's at your front door.
I forgot to turn my notification on. All right, so apologize for that. Okay, so we're going to then begin looking at clues that there were other people on earth. Clues that there were other people on earth besides Adam and Eve. Okay, here we go. All right, and so chapter 4, I'm going to read directly from the Bible. In my book, Evolution of Creation, this information is contained in chapter 8, or this discussion is in chapter 8. So get the book so you can read it in more detail, right? Okay, chapter 4 says, and I'm beginning at first verse, and Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived, and they bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of the sheep, and Cain was a tiller of the ground. Okay, that was a fast forward in time. We don't get Shonda Rhimes with TV shows where they was like, okay, previously or 10 years ago or 5 years later, right? So we see that the guys are born. Now all of a sudden you're telling their occupations. Okay, so a fast forward in time, typically shepherd boys in those days were about 15 years old. Hey, somebody just came in. Why don't you give me a shout out so I can see who you are and where you're coming in from? Okay. So shepherd boys were between 13, 15 years old, and you have these brothers. We don't know how many years spanned their birth. It sounds like they were stair steps, right? Like she had one and then she turned around and had the other. But we don't know. All it says that she knew her husband, she had Cain, and then she knew her husband again, and she had Abel. And we don't know how many years spanned between the two boys. Okay. But again, by biblical history and also anthropology, we know that in biblical times or antiquity, which would be biblical times, shepherd boys were usually around 13 to 15 years old. So if we think about, we fast forward 13 to 15 years, okay, and so that's where we are just in the first two verses. Verse 3, we're going to look at that. And in the process of time, there we go. And in the process of time, meaning more time has passed, right? Okay. It came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord, and Abel he also brought of the firstlings of the flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had no respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. Okay, so here, there's things that have been slipped in there and we're not aware of. Okay, so these boys, one is a keeper of the sheep, so he's a herder. Okay, so he's keeping the animals, and that's Abel. Cain was the farmer, like his dad. Remember, Adam had to till the ground for food. So Cain, the oldest son, followed in the footsteps of his dad and became a farmer. So now it's time to present offerings unto God. Hey, Mother Diana, thank you for joining me, sweetheart. It is wonderful to see you. Okay? So where have you heard that before? Presenting offering to God. In church, right? We pick tithes and offerings, right? So what